and welcome everyone to WTF, What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Code Pink Latin American team's weekly webinar. Today, I'm really pleased to have with me a good friend and immigration activist, Jesse Franzblau, who is the senior policy analyst at the National Immigrant Justice Center. And they just published earlier this week or late last week a new report titled A Legacy of Injustice, the U.S. Criminalization of Migration, which is what we're going to be discussing today. Thanks so much for being on here, Jesse.
Thanks so much, Leonardo, for having me.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that struck me reading this report, which I encourage all of our viewers to also read, we'll include the link in the description and in the comments when we stream it later on Facebook. But one of the kind of the history of migration and how it really ties into white supremacy and how basically it hasn't just been this administration, of course, but successive administrations, how they built up this kind of machine for detaining and prosecuting migrants. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think, so the laws that we're really discussing in depth in this report, the laws that are used to prosecute people for entering the country without authorization or for re-entering the country without authorization, that impact hundreds of thousands of people every year. In fiscal year in 2019, there were over 105 people prosecuted for either illegal entry or re-entry under these laws. And these laws stem back to the 1920s at a time when lawmakers and government officials were passing legislation and pushing policies that were very xenophobic and outwardly discriminatory. And so in 1929, a law passed criminalizing entry. It was a big way, essentially, to please nativists and to and in part please the KKK at that time, where a lot of groups wanted to kind of placate this anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly of folks from Mexico who were coming in to work during that period. And so their kind of compromise was passing a law to criminalize the matter of entry so they could punish people for entering the country and apply these criminal sanctions. And so it goes back, it stems back to this really, of course, dark period of when lawmakers really followed this eugenics philosophy and xenophobic philosophy. And of course, this can be seen today in a lot of the anti-immigrant agenda of this administration. And it can be seen the way that the laws have been applied over the decades. So especially in the 1990s, lawmakers added more penalties to these laws. So these laws are in the US Criminal Code, 8 U.S.C. 1325, which is for the manner of entry, and 8 U.S.C. 1326, which is for the manner of re-entry of people who are deported and then re-enter without authorization, can be prosecuted for 1326. So you often hear these referred to as 1325 and 1326.
And what really struck me about that was that was during the Clinton administration, you saw this kind of push towards criminalizing again and towards prosecutions, which happens to coincide with the signing of NAFTA, which, as we know, caused a surge in migration from Mexico. So, it was almost like the Clinton administration was dealing with one of the negative effects of NAFTA by criminalizing the people that they were harming in the first place.
In the 1990s, so when this is kind of part of this tough on crime, anti-crime era, this agenda where bills like the Crime Act were passed and pieces of legislation in 96 were passed to further kind of criminalize migration particularly. And so they added additional penalties to these laws, such as the illegal entry piece, 1326. And so it's part of this era of these kind of increased penalties and increased criminalization of communities, particularly communities of color, and that led to further mass incarceration that still, of course, manifests today. And then in the early 2000s, in kind of the post 9/11 national securitization of immigration era, these laws were really increasingly used. They skyrocketed, especially in 2005, when under the Bush administration, they created a program called Operation Streamline, which was a special court and a program where the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice worked together to refer people for prosecution and prosecute people in mass. And these mass hearings, upwards of 80 people in a single courtroom, pleading guilty one after one. They enter, they're shackled. They enter these courtrooms in orange jumpsuits or in the same clothes that they have on that they were detained at the border with. And so this is when the numbers really started to ratchet up and started to skyrocket in 2005, and then proceeded at really high levels during the Obama administration, and then have increased even more, of course, under the Trump administration.
And one thing that really kind of caught my eye as well was you have this really interesting kind of table in the report showing, what happens to the people who are prosecuted and or detained by ICE. So if they're prosecuted, they basically go through this long process. But at the end of the day, or not the day, obviously, but at the end of like their sentence, if they're found guilty and imprisoned, they go to ICE and for deportation, which is what would have happened anyway had they not been prosecuted. Do I have that right?
Yeah, essentially. So there are kind of two pathways that people can take. For example, when they're coming over the border. So someone is crossing the border. They decide to go outside of port of entry because either they're trying to avoid the official port of entry, or they simply have no pathway to enter there, because there's so many policies that have come into place, especially under this administration, blocking any pathways to asylum. So people get to the border and they want to request asylum. There's so many programs that force them to wait months in Mexico you can go through the process where people face kidnapping and extreme violence and corruption on the Mexico side of the border. So they cross over outside of a port of entry. They are arrested by border officials, and then the Border Patrol actually have a decision. They can send people either for criminal prosecution for breaking the law, the US law, for entering without permission, or they can just send them over to ICE. So after they hold them in CBP detention, they can just send them to ICE. They go through the DHS process. They wait in ICE detention. They go through this whole civil immigration process where they seek relief, they seek asylum, go through that. Or if they go through prosecution, they are handed over to US Marshals. They go to court. At this stage, a lot of our interviews show that people have not much understanding of where they actually are, what the differences between these courts, because I mean, for anybody, it's incredibly complicated. So they go into US Marshals custody, go into a federal criminal court. They're handed down this prosecution for entering the country without authorization. If they have any other prior entries or prior entry attempts, they can be prosecuted for re-entry or given more prison time. So people are either given time served or prison time, which they either serve in a US Marshals facility or they serve in a Bureau of Prisons facility. They can get upwards of 180 days just for illegal entry. They can get 2 years if they have any prior convictions or prior entries. For illegal re-entry, they can get up to 20 years is the maximum if they have prior criminal record, prior convictions for other issues. Even if they've served those crimes, years past, those can pop up and get more time. But then, as you say, they end up in the same place. They end up in ICE custody, and they go through the process, the civil immigration process to seek relief. If they have a pathway to relief, which it becomes even more difficult because then they have a criminal record if they are convicted for this, for entering or re-entering, and then they end up deported in the same way as they would if they don't get relief, if they weren't prosecuted.
So it's basically just not just a massive waste of taxpayer money to detain these folks, since they're eventually going to be put on a path towards deportation anyway, but it's causing, you know, unquantifiable damage to the people being detained and their families, of course. It doesn't make much sense, really.
Yeah, there's definitely unquantifiable damage, human rights atrocities, human rights violations to people, to families, people returning to try to be with their families. We document just multiple stories of people coming back again and again just to be with their families because they have no life in another country. People who came here when they were really young, when they were babies, when they were children, got caught up somehow in the criminal system, got deported, came back to try to be with their families, got convicted for illegal reentry, and are serving jail time, basically for nothing else than violating these border laws, violating these restrictions. So that is something that we saw constantly, and even the material cost is very hard to quantify. I mean, it's upwards, of course, in the billions over the years. You know, we dig through in the report, we cite some of the congressional budget justifications for Department of Justice, for the U.S. Marshals, for DHS, all these agencies that play part in this. Spend just millions and millions every year. These violations are the most heavily federally prosecuted prosecutions in the country. So upwards of 60% of the federal docket are migration-related offenses. And so the waste is just, yeah, really, really exorbitant.
And it's for an alleged crime where we know that, you know, upwards of 80% of the people who are crossing the border are trying to rejoin family in the United States. So it's not something that can really be prevented, because obviously people will go to great lengths to rejoin their families. I was hoping you could, I mean, you mentioned it briefly, but if you could go into a bit more detail about the sort of human rights violations that we're seeing as a result of these prosecutions.
Yeah, so there were a few categories that we captured in terms of human rights violations, and they definitely weren't exhaustive. There are a lot of violations that happen systematically, and there are groups that have been documenting abuses associated with these prosecutions for a lot of years. But some of the violations that we documented really systematically, we saw violations of asylum rights, violations of due process rights, systematic separations of families, so violation of rights to family unity, as well as systematic dehumanization and racist treatment. So abuses just really associated with the discriminatory treatment that people face through this process. So in terms of due process, as I mentioned, in these Operation Streamline courts, where people are shuttled into court en masse, upwards of 80 people prosecuted at once, their constant due process concerns associated with these prosecutions. There's often only a handful of attorneys. They have very little time to even talk with attorney. They're federally appointed, federal defenders, oftentimes, or panel attorneys that are hired up to carry out to defend these individuals. But they're given very little time. It often all happens in one day. So within a matter of 24 hours, they're brought into court with numerous other people, with dozens of other people, shuttled out. Next thing they know, they're off, shuttled into ICE detention normally, or deported, without even knowing that they had a criminal conviction. Systemic violations of rights of asylum seekers. Of course, people who enter the country, regardless of where they enter, are supposed to be given a chance. So the Border Patrol are supposed to ask a series of questions to determine if an individual has fear of returning to their country because of political violence. And we just documented consistently that people were not asked these questions. They were not given the chance to explain that they had fear to return to their country. They face political violence. And so over 80% of people interviewed in the surveys that we administered were never asked this question. So never had a chance to explain that they had fear of returning before sent for prosecution. And so there are systematic violations of asylum rights, and of course, family unity. You know, the most kind of where this really came to prominence a lot, or came to the forefront, to the public eye, these type of prosecutions and how they impacted people coming across the border, with, of course, the zero tolerance family separation program in 2018, when there was just widespread attention to how horrific the application of these prosecutions can be. So this was when the administration administered a zero tolerance policy, which was essentially prosecute everybody, regardless of if they're with family members, and if they're with their families, take their children and send the parents to court. And of course, this led to thousands of people systematically being ripped apart from their children at the border. So that's, of course, a huge part of this, but also violations of family unity throughout the country. So people who are picked up in cities across the country because of any type of minor infraction, or even pulled over, you know, for a traffic stop, and happen to be in the country without authorization after having entered or after having been deported, then they can face illegal reentry prosecution and potential jail time, or prosecution, or deportation. So we documented, of course, these instances and this systemic violation of family unity as well through this. So not only family separation at the border, but separation of families throughout the country, and then also the systemic dehumanizing and racist treatment that people face. People consistently explained when being interviewed how they felt they're being treated in a way that was discriminatory, that it was because they were an immigrant, because they didn't speak English, because of their gender orientation, because of their race, because they witnessed racist treatment by guards in court, in CBP detention facilities and U.S. Marshals facilities. So it's really a consistent piece of the violations that we documented as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's basically daily violations of not just U.S. law, but international law occurring, you know, not just on the border, but in this whole kind of court system, this prosecution system that's going on.
Yeah, and even so, there have even been studies. The Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General, back in years ago, 2005, I think, was a study where they found that there were possible violations of international obligations related to asylum seekers, related to asylum rights, because the U.S. Is bound by the Refugee Convention and also has domestic law that protects the rights of refugees and people seeking safety. And so these laws, are consistently violated every day through this process.
Is there an estimate of how many people are currently in ICE or CBP detention? And I know you mentioned this earlier, but could you also focus a bit more on the links between what's going on now and mass incarceration in general?
Yeah, so there are an average of, so as a result of migration-related prosecutions, there are an average of around 11,000 people in federal prisons for these prosecutions, but there are also at any given time, over 13,000 people in U.S. Marshals facilities. And so U.S. Marshals facilities, marshals are responsible for the custody of individuals when they go through these prosecutions after they're turned over from the Border Patrol, from CBP to U.S. Marshals. Marshals hold them, they take them through court, and then they hold them in their facilities. Many of their facilities are privatized. So facilities like Otay Mesa and San Diego, California is a facility that holds people for ICE and for U.S. Marshals. And it's a facility that's run by CoreCivic, a major private prison company that has that runs ICE detention facilities, privatized jails all over the country. And so in facilities like this, you have people who are held because they're either awaiting trial for these prosecutions or they are serving their sentences for migration-related prosecutions. And then you also have people who are held in ICE custody. So people could be in this facility waiting their prosecution, go to court, finish their prosecution, even if the charges are dropped, come back, and then get picked up by ICE or CBP, and then go back to the same facility under ICE custody. And of course, throughout these facilities, in the last months, they've become increasingly dangerous and deadly because of the spread of COVID. And in that Otay Mesa facility, people have died because of COVID, because the administration and ICE and the Department of Justice have refused to let people out, to release people at the rate which they could.
And in the report, you go through several recommendations to various institutions, whether it's Congress or the DOJ. Can you talk a bit about the recommendations and tell us what's going on in Congress relating to these migrant prosecutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So there, a few of the urgent asks are, of course, efforts by members of Congress to try to get people released urgently from detention. So there's currently in Congress, they're debating a new COVID relief package, which has, of course, incredibly important provisions, relief for people to get unemployment, support that people need. There's efforts through that to get provisions that mandate that people be released from prisons and jails, including pretrial detention, and so prisons and jails where a lot of people who are sitting incarcerated because of these migration-related prosecutions are facing just really horrific conditions and terrifying conditions because of the spread of COVID. So there are efforts there. So recommendations to mandate the release of people through congressional efforts. There are broader recommendations to repeal these laws that were passed nearly a century ago that are still used to carry out these prosecutions. And there is legislation that was passed in the House, was introduced in the House in December of 2019 by members of Congress that includes provisions that would repeal these laws that criminalize migration, along with a number of other really important provisions that are aimed at disentangling the criminal legal system with the immigration enforcement system. They end mandatory detention. They include a lot of really important reforms. So the New Way Forward legislation is a really important one in terms of this longer term vision that's needed to transform the immigration system. And there are recommendations, of course, for the administration to place a halt on these prosecutions, especially now, during as the COVID crisis still is taking place. These prosecutions are still happening, especially the illegal reentry prosecution. So we document a few cases where ICE is still picking people up and still referring them over to court for criminal prosecutions, where they're being held in detention, awaiting their trial, as COVID is increasingly worse in jails and detention centers. So ending those, and of course, a big one is ending the use of these private facilities, these so-called criminal alien requirement facilities, which were created to hold non-citizens exclusively. So they're privately run facilities. They mostly hold people who are prosecuted for migration-related offenses. And we document one story of one of these facilities in Michigan, where, of course, COVID has spread dramatically. People have died inside. People have gone on hunger strike, demanding their release. These facilities are known for just horrid abuse and discriminatory practices. And so ending these facilities is an enormous one, which is actually not that big of a lift. Under the Obama administration, they actually took measures at one point to stop private prison contracting with the Bureau of Prisons, which would have ended these facilities. But then that measure was revoked under the Trump administration. They continued to contract with these private facilities. Those are a number of the recommendations.
And what can folks at the grassroots level do to, do their part for immigrant justice?
There's a lot of really powerful organizations, community organizations in the DC area, in the DMV area, Sanctuary DMV, La Colectiva, Many Languages, One Voice. Other organizations are doing a lot of really powerful work to raise awareness and to advocate for people's release out of detention, for people's release out of these facilities. So following those organizations is a really important piece. At the national level, following organizations like Mi Gente, which does a lot of really important work at the grassroots level, doing direct defense of people going through these prosecutions, and then also advocating for policy changes. And they do a lot also to document the work of how surveillance technologies really play into these type of prosecutions and play into immigration enforcement. So following groups like that, Just Futures Law is another organization in the DC area that does work at the local and federal level. That's a really important one to follow. So yeah, I think following a lot of the community groups organizing around this is a good piece. Great.
Well, thanks so much for your time today, Jesse. This is a really important report, and also thank you and the NIJC for doing some, amazing work uncovering what's really going on at the border. I know you've been down to the border several times, not recently because of the pandemic, but it's super important work because otherwise we wouldn't hear about it. Thank you again. Hope to have you back on to discuss similar issues soon.
Thanks so much, Leo. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks everyone. Tune in next week for another WTF webinar.